And welcome back. The Drug Policy Alliance envisions a just society which the use and regulation of drugs are grounded in science, compassion, health, as well as human rights, in which people are no longer punished for what they put into their own bodies, but only for crimes committed against others. The organization's mission is to advance those policies and attitudes, best reducing the harms of both drug use and drug prohibition, and to promote the sovereignty of individuals over their minds as well as their bodies. Sharing now is the policy coordinator at Drug Policy Alliance, Queen Adesuyi, and we thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And when we have this conversation talking about drugs and policy, obviously we know that that's a waging conversation and debate all the way from Washington to the Supreme Court, all the way here to New York State. We know here in New York State, we've seen recently the decriminalization of marijuana and legalization of marijuana use. And so share with us a little bit about your perspective when it comes to this and the issue of legalization of drugs and then also drug criminalization.
Yeah, so just to speak to the fact that, we've seen a historic uprising over the last year or so, and we've seen throughout the country and even globally what I would call, urgent calls for transformative change and justice. And I think the impact of the latest campaigns around policing and even around overdose and ending the war on drugs have really spoken to the fact that people are really starting to question what does public safety actually mean? And, what does the systems of policing actually offer to us currently? I mean, who's actually feeling safe under these current systems of policing? So for me, I think it's integral to actually take the several steps to end the war on drugs. And that looks like, legalizing marijuana. But beyond that, it actually looks like really removing criminal penalties for all drugs and drug possession broadly. Ending the war on drugs does not start and stop at legalizing cannabis, even though it is a really important first step. But I think even beyond that, it's really critical to see how New York was successful in its legalization effort through a racial justice perspective.
Yeah, and you talk a little bit more about the sovereignty of what people actually put in their own bodies and not really being able to be held legally accountable for that. Give us your grounds for that perspective.
So June of this year in 2021 marked 50 years since former President Nixon actually declared the war on drugs, declared drugs public enemy number one. And this campaign, this war on drugs, was never actually about public health. It was never actually trying to address a public health issue. It was a political strategy to try to decimate Black communities and the anti-war left. And we've seen 50 years later the impact of that. We've seen how the war on drugs has fed into mass criminalization. We've seen how it's really allowed for policymakers to ignore real issues like homelessness and housing issues, the lack of access to nutritious food in our communities, economic opportunities being bare in communities, educational issues. The focus has just been on drugs and drug use. And none of that focus has not actually bore a better public health outcome. The last place that a person who's actually struggling with addiction should be is a jail cell. So, our actual approaches to drug use is a public health issue. And I think it's important that we actually start to evaluate how criminalization is worsening public health. And it's really kind of the underlying reason why we're seeing such horrible and terrifying overdose rates, not only in the state, but throughout the country. And it's only been worsened by COVID-19. And I think it's going to be really critical to see policymakers reckon with that. And I think, this year marking the 50th anniversary, it gives us an opportunity to try to imagine what we want the next 50 years to look like. And the status quo is just it's not working for us. It's harmful, it's decimated whole communities, especially folks who are living in over-policed communities. Black and brown, Latinx, low-income folks have really bore the brunt of the war on drugs beyond cannabis, in its enforcement, in its lack of access and its barriers to access when people end up having a conviction, the lifelong consequences that come with having a drug conviction on your record. It's a matter of time that we actually just finally end this horrible way of approaching drug use. And then on top of that, address the harm that comes and has come with convictions. We really need a comprehensive shift in how we address drug use. And for me, that starts with, ending criminalizing people for ingesting drugs and for possessing drugs. And just one piece that I want to add in addition to that is really highlighting the work of neuroscientist and psychologist Dr. Carl Hart out of Columbia University. His data and research is really understated when it comes to policy work, but the majority of people who use illicit drugs don't have problematic relationships with their drug use. They're able to live stable, functional, relatively functional lives. It's actually a minority of folks who use illicit drugs, who struggle and who have substance use disorders. But when you focus and socialize people to stigmatize drug use in the way that we see it happening now, we're not able to actually focus on the minority of folks who need help. And we're not able to actually offer them a system of care that's not punishment, and that's not demonizing, and that's not waiving resources that are absolutely necessary to live stable lives in folks' faces. I think it's going to be critical for us to really end stigma and shift away from this fantasy of a drug-free world over to one that's actually grounded in reality and grounded in harm reduction, which I think will actually help us save lives.
Yeah, and I know you're a Bronx girl and you're from New York State, so talk to us a little bit about our state, because you feel as though that our state has done has been a great example of how things work. What is it that you like about New York State when it comes to the issue of handling the drug crisis and decriminalization?
I would say New York definitely still has room to grow, but I will say the campaign that ended up bringing us legalization is one that can help influence the country. And it's one that's mirroring the effort on the federal level through Congress. New York for a long time was the marijuana arrest capital of the country. We're the home to Rockefeller drug laws. We're really the home to a lot of harm when it comes to drug prohibition and over enforcement. And like you said, I grew up in the Bronx and I'm very familiar with how mass criminalization harms people, especially young people. And I think it was really important to see the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act pass this year because of its centering of racial justice and the fact that advocates on the ground have continued to never let up on the fact that we need restitution. It's not enough, it's insufficient to just end, marijuana prohibition now after decades of the way it's impacted people. To put it plainly, like people have lost their children because of proximity to the plant. People have been deported because of marijuana. People have lost their housing, their jobs. Like the harm that has been endured by individuals and families throughout the state and throughout the country is immeasurable. So this lens that we have in terms of ending marijuana prohibition, focusing on equity, making sure that people who have experienced criminalization of marijuana actually have an avenue to the legal market and are not shut out. All of those things are important and they're owed to our communities. So it's really important. I feel really grateful that New York was able to do legalization in this way, because not other states have not been able to do that. Previous campaigns were not as focused on racial justice as we saw in New York and campaigns right before it.
Give me your sentiments on this. We've got the criminalization of crack, we've got the criminalization of cocaine, and up until recently, the criminalization of marijuana use. But then on the other side, we do understand that we're living in the middle of an opioid epidemic. But when it comes to the opioid epidemic, it seems as though there's more victimization than there is criminalization. Your sentiments?
Well, it's funny you say that. I agree that at least in sentiment, policymakers seem to be more compassionate when it comes to the opioid and overdose crisis that we're currently experiencing. And that's mainly because the impact started to really reach suburban communities. It's impacted the children of politicians. The overdose crisis does not see class. But oftentimes that has not actually translated to policy change. So we need more than just compassionate sentiments. And of course, I wish that we can have the same compassion across all overdose crises. that are experienced across all of our communities. But compassion and sentiment is not enough. We need overdose prevention sites. We need aggressive harm reduction measures in place in New York and throughout the country. We need to actually end criminalizing people for drug use. Stop putting people in jail because they use drugs. And we want to be mindful that the world that we're envisioning, post the end of criminalizing people for drug use does not look like mandated and forced treatment. We don't want to swap out incarceration and jail for just forcing people into treatment if they don't need it or want it. Like I mentioned earlier, the majority of people who use illicit substances don't even have substance use disorder. So what we really need to do is use all that money that we are putting towards enforcement of these failed drug laws and actually invest in communities and stop focusing on drugs. I think the drug war, again, has given policymakers permission to ignore the real issues. We can just demonize people for their drug use and ignore the other issues that they're dealing with that are systemic. Homelessness, poverty as a systemic issue, systemic racism as a public health issue. All of these things need to be addressed in order to actually get at overdose and get at broader harms of prohibition.
Can you share with us a little bit about the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act? It's MRTA, as some people know it. But from your perspective, you do believe that that creates an opportunity for what we call restitution and possibly even equity.
Yes, I think the MRTA did its best to try to speak towards those principles.
And let me cut you off, but I do want you also at the same time explain what the act actually is for our viewers.
Yeah, so the act is the legislative vehicle that brought legalization to New York. It passed this year after decades of fighting for this in New York. We saw through the end of criminalizing marijuana in New York State. I think the most important part of this bill and pieces of this bill is the way that it tries to bring forth restitution and acknowledge the fact that marijuana criminalization should have never happened and the way that it was enforced was wrong in our communities. So the MRTA includes things like protections for non-citizens. It includes housing and employment protections. It includes expungement. It includes a robust attempt at trying to increase and facilitate equity in the legal market that is born from the effort to legalize. It sets aside revenue from cannabis sales over to reinvestment for communities. It also marks off, like 50% of licenses for social equity applicants, which is meant to try to facilitate folks who have been marginalized to be able to enter the legal industry. There's a lot of lessons to be learned, and I think what advocates are dealing with is trying to build a plane while flying it. So of course there's going to be room to improve, but I think it's really critical that first and foremost the campaign was centered in the principles of wanting to get restitution and making sure that directly impacted New Yorkers benefit the most from legalization.
And when we talk about the legalization, obviously we do know that puts an end to the criminalization of people, particularly when it comes to marijuana and low-level marijuana offenses. We've seen mass incarceration due to that. What has been the word on the street since New York State has really made this move from what you're gathering from people that you work with?
People are happy. Again, this is just the first step. For us, this was long overdue. I think it should have never even taken this long. For me, when I reflect on the amazing work that happened in getting legalization done in New York, I think about Marley Graham. He was murdered when I was in high school, and that should have never happened. There's so many countless deaths that happened at the hands of police because, and in the name of the drug war, that should have never happened. And unfortunately, those lives will never be able to come back, and justice is still never really going to be served because of the loss of those lives. But I think it's important to see, how legalization happened, again, through this lens of, acknowledging the harms that have happened across communities and wanting to make sure that people are able to actually benefit in the ways that they see fit.
Yeah. So talk to me about some of the work that you're doing right now.
So, in June, that marked the 50th anniversary of the war on drugs, we actually saw the first federal drug decriminalization bill introduced. It was actually introduced by Representative Cori Bush and Representatives Bonnie Watson Coleman from New Jersey, a neighboring state. And that bill, brings forth the first kind of legislation in Congress to allow for the conversation around what it actually means to shift away from criminalizing people for drug use and punishing people over to what it might look like to actually treat drug use as the public health issue it is. Shifting all of our funds away from enforcement over to investment into communities. That's one thing I'm working on. And I'm similarly on the forefront of marijuana justice reform in Congress, which is similar, and it's piggybacking off of the effort in New York to try to ensure that we actually can end marijuana prohibition on the federal level. And I think one important piece to remember in terms of our fight to actually end the collateral harms of prohibition is that some benefits won't really be actualized until federal criminalization ends. One piece that I want to highlight here is around protecting non-citizens. Non-citizens across the country, even in legal states, will not really fully be protected until we actually deschedule. Descheduling is just removing marijuana from the controlled substance list, where it's currently a Schedule I drug, which is the harshest category to be in. And it's the most criminalized on the federal level on that schedule. It has reached its barriers, but on top of that, it means that even in legal states, non-citizens will still face or often be threatened with immigration-related consequences for even working legally in the industry or consuming cannabis or having a previous conviction. So, there are limitations to federal advocacy, but they go hand in hand, what's happening in the states, what's happening on the federal level.
Give me an idea as to what it's been as far as a response from lawmakers when you really start tackling these issues, because we do know that there's many lawmakers, of course, because the bill passed, was in favor of the decriminalization of marijuana and the legalization of marijuana use. But when you talk about these other issues, sometimes you do get this pushback from a lot of lawmakers and legislators. What's been your encounter so far?
Yeah, so DPA convened the Marijuana Justice Coalition back in 2018, and with a lot of work, within 2 years, we were able to pass the first bill to actually end marijuana prohibition on the federal level. That was the MORE Act, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. I think one of the biggest issues that I'm facing with policymakers in Congress, especially, is that folks think that supporting marijuana legalization means that's ending the war on drugs. Again, like, marijuana legalization is just scratching the surface. So there'll be policymakers who are like great on marijuana, but think that we should be harshly criminalizing fentanyl as a response to overdose, for example, or can't really see or understand why we actually should just stop jailing people for drugs, period. And I think the job of advocates at this point is to make sure that we can mobilize, the support that we see around marijuana and extend that to all substances and really get policymakers a better understanding of the drug war broadly. DPA released recently a report that we entitled "Uprooting the Drug War." And it's a report that highlights the way that drug war policies and drug war mentality is actually infiltrating all systems, not just our criminal legal system. Our family regulation system is impacted by the drug war. Our housing system is impacted by the drug war. Until recently, when you're applying for financial aid, you have to check off whether or not you had a drug conviction. The impact is so far reaching. So to just support marijuana legalization and thinking that you're actually ending the war on drugs is a fallacy. So I think learning from the lessons of marijuana exceptionalism and learning from the lessons of our marijuana legalization efforts, we're really looking towards moving policymakers over to ending criminalizing drug possession broadly, because that's what's necessary. It's truly necessary to actually start to get at our really, again, terrifying overdose rates, in addition to an actual investment in harm reduction and access to healthcare, all of the social and economic needs that help stabilize lives. Those are the things that we need to focus on, not punishing people and stigmatizing people because they use drugs.
Yeah. So how can people get involved in, being an advocate and supporting the work that you're doing?
I will say two things. One is on an individual and just a community level, really working to fight against stigma, even if it just comes down to our language. Language is really important, and that actually feeds into the systemic issues that we're dealing with. Drug stigma is real, and that really impacts our relationships, but also policy. So I think, even if you can't wake up and become a drug policy reform lobbyist, you can, in your community and within your own families, push back against stigma, including stigmatizing language. But on the advocacy front, calling your members of Congress, calling your state and local representatives is a really important thing to do. I think folks under realize how important reaching out to your actual representatives are and how impactful it is, especially for advocates who are at the forefront of trying to move reform. It's critical that your representatives are hearing from you and hearing that this is what you want. DPA and the ACLU actually recently released polling data, around the anniversary of the war on drugs that shows that 65% of American voters, support ending criminalizing people for drug possession and actually investing in public health approaches. And even higher than that, 83% of American voters believe that the war on drugs has failed. So this is something that, there's not too many issues that most American voters actually can agree on. So,
Yeah.
I think it's critical that people realize their power, their people power, and demand that the representatives, change and reform these drug policy laws.
Yeah. Well, Queen, it's been great having this conversation with you, and certainly we'll have to bring it back so that way we can get more updates as the legal calendar moves and we see the legislative, I should say, calendar moves, and we see how things are really being addressed. But thank you for your work, and thank you for sharing your perspective with us here.
Thank you for inviting me.